The stagecoach lurched to a stop, wheels grinding against the frozen dirt of Blackthorn, Montana. In the winter of 1879, Clara Everett stepped down, her boots sinking into the snow-dusted road, her breath clouding in the bitter air. The wind bit at her knuckles, raw from clutching a worn carpet-bag that held all she owned, a change of calico, a Bible, and a half-finished quilt. Her dark braid, frayed at the ends, hung heavy beneath a wool shawl, and her gray eyes scanned the town wooden storefronts, a saloon's tinny piano, and faces peering from behind frosted glass, already judging she'd come for a promise. A letter from a cousin, long faded in her memory, offering a new start after the scandal back in Missouri. "Room for you here," it had said. But as Clara approached the sagging porch of the general store where her cousin was to meet her, a woman in a starched bonnet stepped out, her lips a tight line. "You're Clara?" she asked, voice sharp as the icicles above. Clara nodded, hope flickering. The woman's eyes flicked to the carpetbag, then to Clara's face, as if reading. "A sin written there ain't no place for you here," she said. "Not after what you done." Clara's throat tightened. The scandal had followed her, whispers of her time with a half-Cherokee man, a love that ended in blood, and a sign hung round her neck by a mob Indian lover. She'd fled, but the shame clung like damp wool. "I'm your kin," Clara said, softly, her voice steady despite the ache. The cousin's gaze hardened. "Kin don't mean nothin' when you're tainted. Find your own way." The townsfolk watched from doorways, their murmurs a low hum against the wind's howl. Clara stood, rooted, as her cousin turned away, the store's door slamming shut. Snowflakes stung her cheeks, and the cold seeped into her bones, but she didn't move, not yet. She clutched her bag tighter, the quilt's edge brushing her wrist, a reminder of her own stitching, her own survival. Blackthorn was harsh, its people harsher, but Clara had faced worse. She'd find a way. She always did. Clara trudged through Blackthorn's snow-packed streets, the wind slicing through her shawl like a knife. The carpet-bag weighed heavy in her hand, its handle cutting into her palm, but she kept her chin level, ignoring the stares from a blacksmith's window and the saloon's swinging doors. The town felt like a clenched fist, ready to strike. Her cousin's rejection echoed in her chest, a dull bruise, but Clara had learned long ago to bury pain beneath resolve. She found shelter in a livery stable at the edge of town, where the air smelled of hay and horse sweat. The stableman, a wiry man with tobacco-stained teeth, eyed her warily but took her last 2 coins for a night in the loft. "Don't cause trouble," he muttered, spitting into the snow. Clara nodded, her voice locked away. She climbed the rickety ladder, her skirts catching on splinters, and settled into a corner of the loft, where straw prickled through her dress. The horses below snorted, their breath rising in soft clouds. A small comfort in the dimness, unfurling her quilt. Clara traced its patchwork scraps of her mother's apron, a lover's shirt, her own torn petticoat. Each stitch held a memory, a scar. The cold seeped into her fingers, stiffening them, but she wrapped the quilt tighter, its weight a shield against the world's judgment. Her stomach growled, but she had no food, only the Bible in her bag, its pages worn from nights when words were her only company. She didn't open it now. Instead, she stared through a crack in the stable wall, watching snow swirl against the black sky. Each flake of fleeting hope snuffed out. The town's lights flickered in the distance, warm and unreachable. Clara's breath hitched a moment of weakness, but she pressed her lips together. She'd been cast out before, by family, by love, by God, it sometimes seemed. Yet here she was, still breathing, still whole. Tomorrow, she'd find work, a room, a way to stand on her own. For now, she curled into the quilt, the straw beneath her a cradle of survival, and let the silence hold her wounds. Clara woke to the creak of the stable door and the faint glow of dawn seeping through the loft's slats. Her bones ached from the straw bed, but she rose, folding her quilt with care, its patches a map of her endurance. Blackthorn stirred outside, boots crunching snow. A wagon rattling past, but its pulse felt distant, as if she were a ghost haunting its edges. She smoothed her dress, tucked her braid under her shawl, and stepped into the cold, determined to carve a place in this unforgiving town. By noon, she'd found work at Mrs. Hargrove's boarding house, a sagging structure with peeling paint. The widow Hargrove, face creased like old leather, needed someone to mend linens and scrub pots for $1 a week in an attic room. "Don't expect charity," she warned, eyeing Clara's worn boots. Clara nodded, her voice steady. "I don't," she set to work, her needle flashing through torn sheets, her hands raw from lye soap. The rhythm of stitching and scrubbing anchored her, each task a defiance against the whispers trailing her. Townsfolk passed through the boarding house, their glances sharp. Women in bonnets who turned away, men who lingered too long. "That's the one," a laundress hissed to another, her words carrying the weight of Clara's past. Indian lover. Clara kept her eyes on her needle, her stitches tight and even, refusing to flinch. She'd heard worse, felt worse. The shame still stung, but she buried it beneath the clink of pots, the rustle of fabric, the scent of lye and starch. In the attic at night, she lit a single candle, its flame dancing against the slanted ceiling. She pulled out her quilt, adding a scrap of blue calico from a torn apron, her needle threading hope into the seams. The wind howled outside, rattling the window, but Clara worked on, her fingers steady. Blackthorn might judge her, might shun her, but she'd build something here thread by thread, day by day. Her heart, bruised but unbroken, beat with quiet resolve, promising herself she'd never beg for a place in this world. She'd make her own. Clara's days at the boarding house settled into a rhythm of mending and scrubbing, her hands moving with quiet precision. The town's whispers followed her, but she kept her gaze low, her dignity stitched into every careful seam. One frostbitten morning, she crossed the snowy street to the general store. Her coins knotted in a handkerchief for thread and flour. The bell above the door jangled, and the scent of coffee beans and leather greeted her. Warm against the cold behind the counter stood Elias Ward, a rancher-turned-clerk after a hard winter claimed half his herd. His broad shoulders strained, his flannel shirt, and his hazel eyes flecked with gold, met hers without judgment. "Need something, miss?" he asked, his voice low, like the creak of a barn door. Clara set her coins down, naming her items. He moved slowly, gathering spools of thread and a sack of flour, his calloused hands gentle with the goods. When their fingers brushed, passing the bundle, his touch lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary and not bold, but curious. "You're the one at Hargrove's," he said, not a question, as he tied the sack with twine. Clara tensed, waiting for the familiar scorn, but his face held only quiet interest, like he was studying a book's worn cover, not its rumors. "Good with a needle, they say." She nodded, her throat tight, unused to kindness. "I manage," she said, her words soft but steady. Elias leaned on the counter, his gaze tracing her shawl's frayed edge. "Made that yourself?" he asked, nodding at the quilted patch peeking from her basket. Clara's fingers tightened on the handle. "Yes," she said, bracing for mockery. Instead, he gave a small nod, the kind that carried weight. "Takes skill, patience, too." His eyes met hers again, holding no pity, only a flicker of respect that warmed her more than the store's potbelly stove. As she stepped back into the snow, Clara felt his gaze linger, not heavy but steady, like a hand, extended without demand. She clutched her purchases, the cold biting her cheeks, and walked on. The memory of his quiet voice threading through her thoughts a faint, unfamiliar spark in Blackthorn's relentless chill. Clara's visits to the general store became a quiet ritual, her boots crunching through Blackthorn snow every few days for thread or a tin of baking powder. Each time Elias Ward was there, his presence steady behind the counter like a pine standing firm against the wind. Their exchanges were brief, a few words about supplies, the weather, the weight of a flour sack, but they carried a warmth that lingered, softening the edges of Clara's guarded heart. One afternoon, as sleet tapped the store's windows, Elias handed her a spool of black thread, his fingers brushing hers again, deliberate yet gentle. "You're making something, he asked, his hazel eyes catching the gray light, searching her face with that same curiosity she'd come to recognize. Clara nodded, her voice low. "A quilt for the attic." She didn't mention it. Was to keep the cold at bay, or that each patch was a piece of her past, stitched into something whole. He didn't ask, but his gaze held hers, as if he saw the weight of what she didn't say. He began saving small things for her, a skein of thread slightly unraveled, a cracked button, scraps the store couldn't sell. "No sense wasting them," he'd say, sliding them across the counter with a half smile. Clara accepted them, her fingers lingering on the worn wood, her thanks a quiet murmur. Once, he slipped a peppermint stick into her bundle, unwrapped, its red and white stripes bright against the brown paper. "For the trouble of the walk," he said, looking away, rubbing the back of his neck. Clara's chest tightened, not with shame but with something softer, unfamiliar. At night, in the attic's dim glow, she worked on her quilt. Weaving in the scraps, Elias gave her a strip of muslin, a square of faded gingham. Each stitch felt like a conversation, unspoken but real, tying her to him in ways she didn't yet name. The wind howled outside, but the memory of his steady gaze warmed her like a fire banked low but burning. Clara didn't trust easily. She'd learned that lesson in blood, but Elias's quiet respect, his refusal to pry, was a thread she couldn't help but follow. Clara's attic room, lit by a single candle, smelled of lye soap and the faint sweetness of dried apples she'd bartered for at the boarding house. Her quilt, nearly finished, lay across her lap, its patches a tapestry of loss and resilience. The scraps Elias had given her, muslin gingham, a scrap of red flannel, were now part of it, their edges softened by her careful stitches. She'd been thinking of him more, his quiet voice, the way his eyes held hers without demand. It stirred something in her, a warmth she hadn't felt since before the sign. The mob, the shame. One evening, after a long day of mending, Clara sat at her small table, her hands trembling not from cold but from resolve. She reached for a tin of flour, a pinch of sugar saved from her rations, and the last of her dried apples. By candlelight, she kneaded dough, her fingers steady despite the ache in her wrists, and shaped a small tart, its edges crimped with care. It was simple, unadorned, but it was hers, made for him. A risk, small but heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. The next morning, she walked to the general store, the tart wrapped in a clean cloth, her heart thudding beneath her shawl. The bell jangled as she entered, and Elias looked up from tallying accounts, his hazel eyes brightening. "Early today," he said, a faint smile tugging his lips. Clara set her usual order thread, a bit of salt on the counter, then hesitated, her fingers tightened around the cloth bundle. "Made this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, sliding the tart toward him for you. Elias paused, his hands stilling on the ledger. He unwrapped the cloth, revealing the golden crust, the faint scent of apples rising. His gaze lifted to hers, not with surprise but with something deeper, a quiet gratitude that made her breath catch. "Didn't I have to?" he said softly, his fingers brushing the tart's edge as if it were fragile. "But I'm glad you did." He didn't eat it then, just set it carefully aside, but the weight of his look stayed with Clara, warm and steady. As she stepped back into the snow, spring crept into Blackthorn, softening the snow into mud and coaxing green shoots from the earth. The town square buzzed with the annual market, stalls laden with smoked meats, jars of preserves, and bolts of calico. Clara walked through the crowd, her basket heavy with mended linens for Mrs. Hargrove's boarding house, her shawl draped over her shoulders despite the warming air. The quilt she'd finished, vibrant with Elias's scraps, lay folded in her attic, a private triumph she carried in her chest. She felt the townsfolk's eyesome curious. Some cutting as she moved, past a stall of apple butter and woven rugs. Whispers followed, the old label Indian lover still clinging to her like damp cloth. Clara kept her head high, her steps measured, her gray eyes fixed on the path ahead. She'd learned to let the murmurs slide off her, but they still pricked Elias. Stood at the general store's stall, bartering sacks of flour for pelts, his flannel shirt rolled to his elbows. He saw her before she reached him, his hazel gaze catching hers through the crowd, steady as ever. "Clara," he greeted, voice warm, ignoring a woman's sidelong glance nearby. He took her basket, setting it behind the stall with care, as if it held more than linens. "Stay a bit?" he asked, low enough for only her to hear. She nodded, lingering as he handed her a tin cup of cider, the sweetheart scent mingling with the market's dust and leather. They stood side by side, not touching, but close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm when she turned. The townsfolk noticed bonnets tilted, lips pursed, but Elias didn't flinch. He offered her a slice of cornbread from a nearby vendor, breaking it in half with his hands, and when their fingers grazed, Clara felt the heat of it, not just in her skin but deeper, where her heart had begun to thaw. The whispers grew, a soft hum against the market's clamor, but Clara stood taller, her chin lifted. Elias's presence, quiet and unyielding, was a shield she hadn't asked for, but welcomed for the first time in Blackthorn. She felt seen not for her past, but for the woman standing here now unafraid. The summer air hung warm over Blackthorn, carrying the scent of pine and sun-baked earth. Clara sat on a fallen log at the edge of Elias's small ranch, a mile from town, where he'd invited her to see his horses. The sky burned orange, stars just beginning to prick through, and a fire crackled nearby, its smoke curling into the dusk. Clara's hands rested in her lap, fingers tracing the edge of her shawl, the quilted patches now familiar to her touch. Elias sat beside her, close but not crowding, his elbows on his knees, staring into the flames. They'd spent the evening, in quiet rhythm, her helping him mend a bridle, him showing her a colt with a star-shaped mark on its flank. Words had been few, but each glance, each small gesture, wove them closer. Now with the fire's glow on his face, Elias's hazel eyes turned to her, softer than she'd ever seen. "Clara," he said, his voice low, like the hum of the wind, through the pines. "I ain't one for talking much, but you're different." Her breath caught, her heart a tight knot. She wanted to look away, to shield herself from the weight of his words, but his gaze held her, steady and true. "You don't ask about before," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The past a shadow between them. He shook his head, slow. "Don't need to. I see you now, your hands, your heart, the way you keep going." He paused, rubbing his thumb across his knuckles. "You're more than what they say. Always have been." Clara's eyes stung, the fire blurring. No one had ever spoken to her like this, not with pity, not with judgment, but with a quiet certainty that saw her whole. She reached for his hand, tentative, her fingers brushing his calloused palm. He closed his hand around hers, warm and firm, and for a moment, they sat in silence, the crackle of the fire louder than their words. Then, slow as dawn, he leaned closer, his lips brushing hers, a kiss soft but sure, sealing the truth they'd both felt growing. Clara's heart opened, not in a rush, but like a flower warmed by the sun, steady and real. Autumn painted Blackthorn in hues of amber and rust, the air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves. Clara stood on the porch of Elias's cabin, now their home, her hands smoothing the skirt of a simple cream dress, its hem brushed by the breeze. The quilt, vibrant with patches of their shared story, hung over the railing, a quiet testament to her resilience. Today, bade Mary, not in the town's church with its judging eyes, but here, under the open sky, with only a preacher and a handful of witnesses. Mrs. Hargrove, The stableman, a few ranch hands who'd come to respect Elias's steady heart. Elias stood beside her, his flannel traded for a clean vest, his hazel eyes bright with a warmth that anchored her. The preacher's words were brief, plain as the land around them, binding their lives with vows, spoken soft but sure. Clara's voice didn't waver as she promised to stand by him, her heart full, not with the weight of the past but with the lightness of now. Elias's hand found hers, his grip firm, and when he slipped a plain silver band onto her finger, it felt like a stitch sealing, a wound long carried. After, they stood together as the sun dipped low, the witnesses gone, the world quiet save for the rustle of leaves and the distant whinny of a horse. Clara leaned into Elias, her cheek against his shoulder, the quilt draped over them both. The town's whispers, once sharp as thorns, had faded to a distant hum. She'd outlasted them, not by fighting but by living. Elias's arms circled her, his breath warm against her hair. "You reminded me who I already was," she murmured, her voice steady. The words, a truth carved deep. The stars emerged, pinpricks of light above the cabin, the garden, the life they'd built. Clara's hand rested on Elias's chest, feeling his heartbeat, steady as her own. They didn't need more words. The silence held them, rich with dignity and peace. A love grown not from grand gestures but from shared scars, quiet kindness, and the courage to begin again.